Video of a man stabbed multiple times inside a Metro Atlanta jail.
Justice can be served in many ways, but for some of the most notorious law offenders, their ultimate punishment comes not from the law, but from their own peers.
Hey, bro, why you just punch him, bro?
Behind the cold, unforgiving walls of prison, a different kind of justice reigns, one where the brutal and the ruthless are often met with the same cruelty they once inflicted on others. So, how did karma deal with these evildoers? Tonight, we explore the shocking stories of dangerous killers who met a brutal end in prison. Number 10, Leroy Martin.
The Gaffney Strangler, a look back at the terror that was happening 55 years ago. Our Ashley Garrett details the Black History exhibit 1968, the year that shocked the nation.
Leroy Martin, infamously known as the Gaffney Strangler, was a notorious serial hitman from Gaffney, South Carolina. He once said, "Sometimes there just ain't no news, and people have to do things to make news." Indeed, he made bloody headlines by committing heinous crimes that terrorized the small town in Cherokee County between 1964 and 1968. On the night of May 20, 1967, Annie Lucille Dedmond had one drink too many and left her husband, Roger, outside a donut shop in Gaffney. This behavior was somewhat typical for her after drinking, leading Roger not to immediately worry about her disappearance. However, the following morning brought sickening news. Annie's body was found in the center of a highway connecting the towns of Union, South Carolina, and Spindale, North Carolina. She had been strangled and defiled. The police focused their investigation on Roger, suspecting him of murder. Despite his insistence on his innocence, the little evidence led to his conviction by a jury. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison and sent to the Union County prison camp. But this was far from the end of the story. 9 months later, in February 1968, 20-year-old Nancy Carol Paris was abducted. Her husband reported her missing after she failed to return from walking their dog at night. Meanwhile, a 14-year-old girl, Nancy Christine Reinhardt, had been missing since January 1968. It seemed there was no connection between these abductions. However, about a month later, Bill Gibbons, managing director of the Gaffney Ledger, received an anonymous call from Leroy Martin, who claimed responsibility for Annie Dedmond's murder, asserting her husband was not the culprit. Martin also disclosed the locations of 2 additional bodies in the Gaffney area and gave Gibbons one specific instruction. The police went to the disclosed locations and found the nude body of Nancy Carol Paris on a riverbank under a bridge. She had been strangled and defiled, but this time there were cigarette burns covering her back. The police also found the body of Nancy Reinhardt, molested and strangled with a ligature. While police were actively investigating 2 murders, Martin contacted Bill Gibbons again, threatening further violence. True to his word, he kidnapped 15-year-old Opal Diane Buxton, forcing her into his car's trunk as she walked to a school bus stop with her sister, who later described the vehicle to police. Days later, authorities found Buxton's body in a wooded area. She had been stabbed and strangled. Shortly after, a major manhunt was launched. During the search, 2 volunteers, Henry Tranzu and Lester Skinner, noticed a black sedan parked off a dirt road, which matched the vehicle description provided by authorities. They followed the car until it stopped in a driveway, where they recorded the license plate number and left. The vehicle was registered to Martin, who was quickly apprehended after his car was seen near where Buxton's body was discovered. On February 17, Martin was formally charged with 4 counts of murder. Shortly thereafter, on February 28th, Roger Dedmond was released from prison after wrongfully serving 9 months for a crime he did not commit. During the legal proceedings, Martin consistently chose to forego a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial. Ultimately, he was convicted on all charges and received 4 consecutive life sentences. The sheriff of Gaffney later explained that the death penalty was not pursued for Martin due to concerns about how the evidence had been obtained. There was a risk that procedural errors might have allowed Martin to be acquitted entirely. While serving his sentence at the Central Correctional Institution, Martin made a chilling confession to his mother. He claimed that his violent half was responsible for the murders, asserting that this malevolent persona had overtaken his physical actions. Martin's life ended violently when he was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate, Kenneth Rumsey, on May 31, 1972. Shortly after terminating Martin, Rumsey hanged himself in his cell. Number 9. Thor Christensen. In the mid to late 1970s, the University of California at Santa Barbara became the backdrop for a chilling series of crimes that gripped the community with fear. Dubbed the look-alike murders, these horrific events unfolded as several female students, who bore a striking resemblance to one another with their long, straight hair and similar builds, were tragically murdered. The nightmare began in late 1976 when Jacqueline Rook, a 21-year-old student, vanished from a bus stop in Goleta. On the same fateful day, another young woman, Mary Saris, also disappeared. Pattern of terror continued into early 1977 when Patricia Laney, another 21-year-old, went missing under similar circumstances. Bodies of these young women were later found in remote areas, each having been fatally shot in the head. The sinister link between these cases remained a mystery until a critical breakthrough occurred in 1979. Lydia Preston, a 24-year-old woman, narrowly escaped death when she was shot in the ear by a man who had offered her a ride. Despite her severe injuries, she managed to escape and later identified her assailant in a bar. This led to the arrest of Thor Christensen, a local who had previously been questioned but not considered a suspect. In the early 1980s, Thor Christensen faced murder charges in Santa Monica for ending the life of Laura Benjamin. He initially claimed insanity to avoid a harsh sentence. As the trial progressed, he admitted to having mental issues that impaired his judgment. Despite this, the jury convicted him of murder, convinced by evidence and expert testimony that he had planned his actions. A few months later, in Santa Barbara, Christensen was on trial again, this time for multiple murders in the Isla Vista area. He pleaded guilty to all charges, and the court sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison. Less than a year into his sentence, Christensen's life ended abruptly when he was stabbed in the prison yard on March 30th, 1981. The person who stabbed him was never identified, leaving a mysterious end to his violent story. Number 8. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was a Colombian serial hitman who was convicted of murdering 72 girls and young women in Ecuador in the 1980s. He was also suspected of murdering several girls in Colombia. Barbosa had a difficult childhood. He was often mistreated by his father and was forced to work long hours on the farm. In 1984, Barbosa was arrested in Colombia for the molestation and murder of a young girl. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he escaped after serving only 2 years. Barbosa fled to Ecuador, where he began a life-terminating spree. He targeted young girls and women, often luring them into his home with the promise of work or food. He would then strangle them and dismember their bodies. Barbosa was eventually captured in Ecuador in 1986. He confessed to taking the life of 72 girls and young women, and he led authorities to the dumping grounds of the bodies. The bodies had been dismembered. Barbosa was sentenced to 160 years in prison in Ecuador. He died in prison in 1994 at the age of 56. They're suspicious that the numbers of his crimes doubled what he had confessed to. Most of Barbosa's victims were poverty-stricken young girls and women who came from dysfunctional families. He lured them into his home with the promise of work or food. Once he had them inside, he would strangle them and dismember their bodies. Barbosa was a sadistic hitman who enjoyed the suffering of his victims. He would sometimes cut off their hair and clothes, mutilate them, and leave their bodies to rot in public places. Barbosa's crimes shocked Ecuador and led to a wave of public outrage. The government was accused of incompetence and neglect of the safety of its citizens. Barbosa was a case study for forensic experts. He was one of the first serial hitmen to be caught with the help of criminal profiling. All the controversies caught up with him as Barbosa's life was ended in prison in 1994 by another inmate, Giovanni Noguera. Noguera was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder. Barbosa's death brought an end to a dark chapter in Ecuadorian history. His crimes were a reminder of the dangers that women and girls face in the country. Number 7. The Angel of Death, Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey, also known as the Angel of Death, was an American serial law offender who confessed to murdering 87 people, though he was officially convicted of 37 murders. Harvey began taking people's lives with such glee in 1970 and continued until 1987, targeting patients in hospitals where he worked as an orderly and nurse's assistant in Ohio and Kentucky. At only 18 years old, Harvey began working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Over the course of 10 months, he claimed the lives of at least 12 patients. From there, he started a hitman run that mainly targeted helpless hospital patients. His methods of ending their lives were alarmingly varied, including arsenic and cyanide in food or injections. He also used insulin overdoses, suffocation, life support shutdowns, and contaminated intravenous fluids with hepatitis B. Additionally, he sometimes induced peritonitis by inserting a coat hanger into a catheter, causing a fatal abdominal puncture. For 17 years, Donald Harvey concealed his crimes until an error in March 1987 exposed him. The unexpected death of John Powell, who had been on life support after a motorcycle accident, led to a revealing autopsy by Dr. Lee Lehman. Detecting the smell of cyanide in Powell's stomach, Lehman identified Harvey as a key suspect, particularly after discovering Harvey had previously been dismissed from the Cincinnati VA hospital for stealing body parts for occult rituals. During police interrogation, Harvey confessed to taking the life of Powell with cyanide, claiming it was an act of mercy. Harvey said, "I felt what I was doing was right. I was putting people out of their misery. I hope if I'm ever sick and full of tubes or on a respirator, someone will come and end it." In August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 murders, receiving 3 life sentences under a plea agreement. He later admitted to 9 additional murders in November, resulting in an extra 20-year sentence concurrent with his previous one. Altogether, Harvey confessed to 37 murders, but claimed the total might be as high as 50. On March 28, 2017, Harvey was discovered in his cell, critically injured from a severe beating. He succumbed to his injuries from blunt force trauma. 2 days later, on March 30th, Harvey's angel of death was fellow inmate James Elliott. A fitting end? Perhaps it was. Number 6, Albert DeSalvo. Between 1962 and 1964, the Boston area was plagued by a series of heinous and brutal murders committed by an individual who came to be known as the Boston Strangler. This hitman targeted single women, ranging in age from 19 to 85, within the safety of their own homes across Boston and its suburbs. The victims were subjected to molestation and strangulation, with the hitman using ropes, stockings, and cords to silence them forever. Despite tireless efforts by city police and homicide detectives, the murder cases remained unsolved for years, leaving the community gripped with fear and uncertainty. However, on March 6, 1965, Albert DeSalvo, a convicted criminal from Massachusetts, confessed to all the murders. Yet, there was a glaring lack of physical evidence to support DeSalvo's confession as the Boston Strangler, and he was only prosecuted in 1967 for a series of unrelated attacks, resulting in a life sentence. He was never charged for the murders of 13 women who suffered a horrific fate at the hands of the hitman. His claim of being the one who ended the lives of multiple women remained shrouded in controversy, with ongoing debates about his actual involvement in the crimes. That remained an ongoing debate until the narrative changed in 2013, when groundbreaking advancements in DNA technology allowed for a reinvestigation of some cases. In July 2013, DNA analysis on semen found on Mary Sullivan, the last known victim of the Strangler, yielded a significant match. The DNA matched that of DeSalvo's nephew, suggesting a familial link, as Y DNA is consistent among male relatives, excluding 99.9% of other potential matches. This breakthrough finding reignited the discussion surrounding DeSalvo's involvement in the Boston Strangler murders, bringing new clarity to the case. Authorities then exhumed DeSalvo's body, and the results came the next day. There was no forensic evidence to link Albert DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder until then. Advances in the sensitivity of DNA testing allowed for a familial match between biological evidence recovered from the crime scene and a suspect in Mary Sullivan's murder. That suspect was Albert DeSalvo. Coming back to his arrest and life sentence, DeSalvo escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital in 1967 with 2 inmates, leaving a note claiming the escape aimed to expose poor conditions and his mental health struggles. Despite a manhunt, he eluded capture until he surrendered 3 days later through his lawyer. He was then moved to Walpole, a maximum security prison. Then, on November 25, 1973, DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. Robert Wilson, believed to be associated with the notorious Winter Hill Gang, was charged with his murder. However, the trial resulted in a hung jury, and Wilson was not convicted. Later revelations by his lawyer suggested that DeSalvo's murder was related to his involvement in selling amphetamines at prices below those set by a prison-enforced syndicate, leading to deadly consequences. Number 5, Whitey Bulger, James Joseph. Whitey Bulger, the ruthless boss of the predominantly Irish Winter Hill Gang, ruled the Boston underworld with an iron fist from the 1970s through the 1990s. His grip on organized crime was so tight that the FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list for over 16 years, second only to Osama bin Laden. Bulger's criminal empire, marked by brutal violence, made him one of America's most feared crime lords, so much so that he inspired Jack Nicholson's character in the 2006 film The Departed. Bulger's youth was marked by frequent incarcerations for molestation and theft charges. By 1956, his criminal ambitions had escalated to hijacking, earning him a stint in the nation's toughest federal prisons, including the notorious Alcatraz. It was here that Bulger participated in the CIA's experimentations with hallucinatory substances like LSD, a desperate bid for sentence reduction. Released in 1965, Bulger quickly rejoined the criminal world, aligning with the Killeen Gang amid a gang war. His criminal activities escalated when he mistakenly ended the life of a man he thought was a rival. By 1972, after switching to the Mullen Gang, Bulger became a leading figure in Boston's underworld, using murder and violence to maintain control and eliminate informants, known in mob terms as rats. In 1979, following the arrest of the Winter Hill gang leaders for fixing horse races, Bulger took on a full leadership role. Interestingly, only a handful of people knew at the time that he had been an FBI informant since 1974. Throughout the 80s, Bulger expanded his criminal activities, shaking down narcotics distributors and supplying weapons to the Irish Republican Army. Despite his involvement in drugs, he maintained a code against heroin in South Boston. However, as law enforcement outside the FBI began to suspect his activities, they started a focused investigation in 1994. This is where Bulger's FBI contact and friend, Agent John Connolly, tipped him off. Bulger fled and remained a fugitive for 16 years until he was caught in 2011 in California. In 2011, the FBI devised a plan to draw an unsuspecting James Bulger out of his seaside apartment. They informed him through a phone call that his lockbox in the building's basement parking area had been tampered with. When Bulger went to investigate, the FBI arrested him. An FBI agent recalled, "We gave the words, 'Hey FBI, get your hands up,' and his hands went up right away at that moment. We told him to get down on his knees, and he told us he ain't getting down on his knees." Even at the age of 81, Bulger wanted to assert control. On July 6, 2011, James Bulger was charged with 48 federal crimes, including 19 murder charges. In 2013, he was found guilty on 31 charges and received a life sentence plus 5 additional years. After his conviction, James Bulger was incarcerated in multiple federal prisons, spending the most time in Coleman, Florida. On October 30, 2018, shortly after being transferred to Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia, 89-year-old Bulger, who was using a wheelchair due to a hip injury, was murdered by fellow inmates. They beat him to death, using a padlock placed inside a sock, and it was also reported that his eyes had been gouged out. Number 4, Donald Leroy Evans. The sinister tale of Donald Leroy Evans is a mysterious and terrifying account of a hitman's reign of terror. When he was arrested in 1991, Evans shockingly confessed to taking the lives of over 70 people across 21 states. A staggering claim that would make him the most prolific hitman in United States history, if true. According to Evans, he targeted his victims at rest areas and public parks, notorious hotspots for mysterious disappearances, suggesting a possible link to many unsolved murders at truck stops. However, the police were skeptical, doubting that Evans was responsible for all the crimes he claimed. Evans' choice of victims, often vulnerable individuals like the homeless and love peddlers, made the investigation especially challenging, as these groups are less likely to be reported missing. But what led to his arrest in the first place? On August 1, 1991, Evans kidnapped a 10-year-old girl from a Mississippi park, subjecting her to a horrific ordeal. He defiled her and strangled her to death, leaving behind a trail of devastation. Evans was arrested 4 days later in Colorado and almost immediately confessed to the heinous crime. At trial, the medical examiner testified that the girl was conscious and could feel pain throughout her day-long ordeal, a harrowing detail that underscored the brutality of Evans's actions. On August 16, 1993, Evans was convicted of battery and murder by a Mississippi jury. 3 days after the conviction, the jury, declining the option of life imprisonment, sentenced him to death. During the proceedings, Evans himself expressed a desire for the death penalty, saying, "I want to be executed by the state for my crimes against humanity." In a twisted irony, Evans met his end while on death row in 1999, when he was fatally stabbed by fellow inmate Jimmy Mack during a walk to the showers. Mack used a makeshift prison knife for the attack, and the exact motive remains unclear, though it's speculated that Mack, who was black, was provoked by Evans' open boasts about his white supremacist beliefs. Number 3. Charles Schmid. Charles Howard Schmid Jr., infamously known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, an American hitman with a peculiar appearance and a penchant for manipulation. Schmid stood at just 5 feet 3 inches tall, but he attempted to compensate for his height by wearing oversized cowboy boots stuffed with rags, making him appear more intimidating. He also dyed his hair black and drew a fake mole on his face to project a meaner image. However, these superficial attempts to intimidate were merely a facade, hiding the darker secrets he concealed behind his face. Schmid's first known murder occurred in 1964, when he brutally took the life of 15-year-old Aline Rowe. With the help of his 18-year-old girlfriend, Mary French, and his friend, John Saunders, Schmid lured Rowe to the desert, where he molested and murdered her, burying her in a shallow grave. Aline was chosen simply because Schmid wanted to experience the thrill of taking a life. His second and third victims were sisters, Gretchen and Wendy Fritz. In August 1965, he murdered 17-year-old Gretchen, who had been secretly dating him, and then killed her younger sister, 13-year-old Wendy, who could have potentially exposed him. He buried their bodies in the desert, similar to his first murder. Schmid's downfall began when his own circle of friends turned against him. Richard Burns, a friend who had grown increasingly disturbed by Schmid's actions and confessions, traveled to Ohio and confessed to the police about Schmid's heinous crimes. Burns led the police directly to the shallow graves, providing irrefutable evidence that launched a full investigation. Schmid was arrested and charged with the murders, bringing an end to his reign of terror. His trial attracted national attention, showcasing his disturbing charm and the brutal nature of his crimes. In 1966, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to 50 years in prison. However, Schmid's life was cut short when he was fatally stabbed 47 times by 2 fellow inmates on March 20, 1975. He lost an eye and a kidney, succumbing to his injuries 10 days later, on March 30th, 1975. In a bizarre ending to his story, Schmid's body was stolen from the morgue, but was eventually recovered by the police. This strange finale added another layer of intrigue to the already complex and disturbing tale of Charles Howard Schmid Jr., the Pied Piper of Tucson. Number 2, Gerard John Schaefer. When the person entrusted with protecting civilians turns out to be totally the opposite of what the person was entrusted to be, the consequences are often devastating. This was the case with Gerard John Schaefer Jr., a former Martin County deputy sheriff who prosecutor Robert Stone described as the most deviant individual he had ever encountered, someone who made notorious serial life-taker Ted Bundy seem like a Boy Scout in comparison. Schaefer's dark reign of terror began on July 21, 1972, when he made his first known attempt at murder. Under the false pretense of enforcing a non-existent law against hitchhiking, Schaefer detained 2 unsuspecting hitchhikers, Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter. He promised to drive them to the beach, but instead took them to a secluded swamp, where he tied them to a tree at gunpoint. However, his sinister plans were interrupted by a call on his police radio, forcing him to leave the scene. Seizing the opportunity, Wells and Trotter managed to escape and sought help at the very police station where Schaefer worked. When Schaefer discovered their escape, he frantically called his boss, admitting his heinous act, and was immediately fired and arrested on charges of unlawful imprisonment and aggravated attack. Despite striking a plea deal that led to a relatively short prison sentence, Schaefer was soon back to his deadly activities. Merely 2 months after posting bail, he kidnapped another 2 hitchhikers, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, to fulfill his twisted and sinister intentions, marking the beginning of a journey that would claim the lives of up to 30 women. After murdering them, he buried their bodies, which were discovered while he was already in prison for his previous crimes. This prompted a search at the home Schaefer shared with his mother and wife, revealing a disturbing collection: 11 guns, 13 knives, and horrific short stories he wrote detailing murders. Even more sickening was the collection of personal items from various missing women, including jewelry, clothing, and even human teeth. Despite overwhelming evidence, Schaefer was only tried for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, receiving a life sentence sufficient to keep him behind bars indefinitely. In prison, Schaefer befriended infamous hitmen like Ted Bundy and Otis Toole, discussing criminal tactics with them. Throughout his time in prison, Schaefer stuck to his claim of innocence, saying, "What are you accused of?" "Well, I was originally accused of taking the lives of 34 women, but nobody has ever managed to come up with 34 names, jurisdictions, or anything else. It's a false accusation." Schaefer was not a well-liked person in prison. On December 3, 1995, he was found dead in his cell, stabbed over 40 times about the face, head, neck, and body, with his throat also being slashed, his right eye destroyed, and several ribs fractured. The attack was carried out by Vincent Rivera, a fellow inmate serving a sentence for double murder. Schaefer's life ended in prison, reportedly for being an informant. Inmates had previously attacked him, and his death was seen as retaliation for reporting on a high-ranking prisoner. The prison code "snitches get stitches" was taken to a gruesome extreme in Schaefer's case, as he received far more than stitches. Number 1. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer stands as one of the most horrible hitmen in history, notorious for his ghastly acts of flesh-eating and fascination with death. Over a span of 13 years, from 1978 to 1991, Dahmer unleashed a reign of terror, primarily targeting vulnerable men in a series of horrific fatal acts that shocked and repulsed the world. The first of his long list of ugly acts occurred in 1978, shortly after his high school graduation in Bath Township, Ohio, where he committed the heinous crime at his family home. This gruesome act marked the beginning of what would become one of America's most chilling criminal cases. Dahmer's acts are particularly spine-chilling, not just because of the number of victims, but also due to the gruesome nature of his crimes, which included flesh-eating, odd activities with dead bodies, and dismemberment. His targeting was often opportunistic, preying on individuals he thought would not be immediately missed, such as marginalized young men, including African American, Asian, and Latino individuals. After committing his first act in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer did not commit any of his acts again until a decade later. During this nearly decade-long break, he struggled with his identity and compulsions, leading a self-assessment life that included brief college attendance, service in the United States Army, and various encounters with the law for lesser crimes. His second victim, Stephen Tuomi, was met at a bar in Milwaukee, marking the beginning of a killing spree that would claim numerous lives. Dahmer's subsequent sinful acts, mainly carried out in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, largely targeted poor and marginalized young men, whom he lured home with promises of money or some fun. He would then give them alcohol laced with substances, strangle them to death, and engage in unusual acts with the corpses before dismembering them and disposing of them, often keeping body parts as souvenirs. He frequently took photos of his victims at various stages of the murder process, allowing him to recollect each act afterward and relive the experience. Eventually, his acts caught up with him, and he was arrested on July 22, 1991, after a man with handcuffs on his wrist led police to Dahmer's apartment, where they found Polaroids of dismembered bodies and other incriminating evidence. Dahmer was subdued when an officer discovered the horrifying photos, and he said, "For what I did, I should be dead." Jeffrey Dahmer's trial started in January 1992 amid heightened racial tensions, as most of his victims were black, leading to strict courtroom security, including bulletproof barriers. He was sentenced on February 15, 1992, to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with a 16th term added later after the jury rejected his insanity plea and found him guilty on all counts. Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death in prison on November 28, 1994, by a fellow inmate, Christopher Schaefer, who attacked him and another inmate with a metal bar. Schaefer, who later reported having schizophrenia, said, "God told me to do it." In 2015, he told the New York Post that Dahmer's disturbing habits in prison, such as shaping his food to resemble body parts, also motivated the attack. Dahmer died about an hour after the attack, and the other inmate succumbed to his injuries days later. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.